Okay, I think it's going to be time to get started. A warm welcome to today's webinar. My name is Michael Halling. I'm a professor of finance at the University of Luxembourg and have the pleasure of moderating this event that has been jointly organized by the Faculty of Law, Economics and Finance at the University of Luxembourg and the Luxembourg Sustainable Finance Initiative, LSFI. This event today is part of an entire webinar series called Luxembourg Sustainable Finance Seminar Series, which was launched back in 2021 by the LSFI and the University of Luxembourg. The goal of this webinar series is to bring together research and practice in order to discuss sustainable finance topics from various angles. Today's discussion will be focused on strategies and best practices for an effective investor engagement. I will do a very short introduction to set the stage and then hand over to our two speakers today, Clara Melot from PRI and Hans-Christoph Hirt from UBS, who will each have around 10 minutes for a short presentation on their views on this topic. We will then continue with a panel discussion to reflect a little bit on what has been discussed and presented before, and finally close the session with a Q&A with the audience. Thus, very importantly, if you have any questions throughout this event for our speakers, please use the chat, drop them in the chat so that we can collect them and try to include them in the discussion afterwards. Without any further ado, let's get started to make best use of our time. As we all know, asset managers and investors are expected to contribute to the transition to more sustainable societies. Industry statistics show that substantial amounts of capital are now being invested according to ESG principles. The large majority of these ESG funds follow filter-based approaches, meaning that they either exclude certain investments completely or tilt their portfolios towards sustainable or green investments and away from unsustainable or brown investments. However, whether this reallocation of capital has any impact on the underlying firms, so whether it incentivizes low ESG firms to change and improve, is less clear. In fact, if you look into recent academic studies, there is some tendency that these studies argue that pure reallocation of capital might have relatively little impact, might have relatively little bite on the underlying firms in order to motivate them to change. This puts the spotlight on stewardship activities or engagement-based strategies in which asset managers and investors directly interact with portfolio firms and try to enact change in order to create long-term value. To clarify, the term stewardship is the broader concept and capturing anything whenever financial investors interact with portfolio firms through voting, shareholder proposals, or more informal ways of interacting. Engagement-based approaches are usually considered to be a subset of stewardship. In this webinar, we're discussing any kind of activities in which an asset manager or investor interacts with the portfolio firm in one way or another, including voting. If it comes to academic studies that look at engagement-based strategies, there are unfortunately relatively few studies available, which is mostly due to the scarcity of data, as engagement oftentimes happens in a more informal way using informal channels. I will try to mix in a little bit of the evidence later on in the discussion when we go to reflect on some of the topics, but let's move on to our speakers in order to learn more about best practices. We will start with Clara Melot, who joined the PRI stewardship team in January 2022, where she focuses on supporting collaborative stewardship practices. Prior to joining the PRI, she spent 5 years at CSL, an environmental conservation organization, leading its engagement with the financial sector on ESG issues linked to soft commodity production. Clara has a Master of Research in Information and Communication Science from La Sorbonne University and a Master of Science in Environmental Policy and Regulation from the London School of Economics. Welcome, Clara, to the webinar. Thanks a lot for taking your time. We're very much looking forward to your presentations. The floor is yours. Please share your slides.
Michael, thank you for having me, and thank you for the invitation from the LSFI. I'll start sharing my screen right now. My presentation today will focus on best practice when it comes to outcomes-focused stewardship. And I think that's perhaps one of the, the notion of outcomes is perhaps the most important here. When we think about stewardship, they can be concerns about a number of issues, including the fact that stewardship is a costly activity that is not necessarily mandated within all the relationships between investors and their clients, and that it may be difficult to implement. It might require a lot of expertise, and in certain cases, it is not clear what its value added is, or that is at least a concern. In terms of practical implementation, it is often seen as a process-based activity, and it is also often focused on single issuers and single issues, sometimes with a narrow time scope in mind in terms of what results might need to be obtained, as opposed to thinking about the long term. And when it comes to whether outcomes are actually achieved, again, if the focus is on process, there can be difficulties understanding what has actually been achieved. There can also be difficulties in setting ambitious enough outcomes which actually make a change in the real world, and therefore actually has an impact also on issues related to financial performance in the long term. And there can be difficulty in simply just measuring what has happened in financial terms, which is usually the preferred way of considering the impact of activities in the financial sector. And so perhaps what's missing here in terms of trying to understand stewardship and whether it is working, and to address greenwashing concerns or concerns that it might be displacing other activities, such as, for example, regulation, is to try to rethink in which term we are considering stewardship. The definition that the PRI has of stewardship is not only, the interactions between investors and investee companies, but actually the use of influence by investors to maximize overall long-term value. And this doesn't necessarily just mean considering it in purely financial terms as we are used to measuring it, but thinking about the value of economic assets, social assets, and environmental assets, on which beneficiaries' interests actually rely. And so the keywords here are not only these interactions, but also the influence and the outcomes that are being sought after. As I mentioned, we often consider stewardship from the perspective of addressing risk to individual assets, building on issues related to governance mostly. And that's a very important aspect. Obviously, you need to engage with investee companies. But perhaps we also need to think about the wider context in which companies are set, and they do not exist in a vacuum. And therefore, stewardship should also try and consider the extent to which it can be used to address systemic issues which are posing threats to companies and to long-term value within these companies. And this is, all in the spirit of delivering against beneficiaries' interest in the long term within a functioning financial system. Again, what's the point of having a beautiful house if the neighborhood is on fire? I'm sorry, I can't credit that very nice analogy because I have heard it a couple times, but I really thank the person who came up with it. And so the way the PRI envisages, best practice in terms of stewardship is what we've decided to coin active ownership 2.0. Active ownership and stewardship are relatively interchangeable terms. So here the focus is on the 2.0 aspect. So it's a stewardship that not only looks at addressing sustainability risk at the company level, but also looking at the sustainability outcomes, that undermine the wider that might underpin the wider environment in which the company operates. It considers the usefulness of direct stewardship, but also the usefulness of broader stewardship. And I'll go back to this in a second. But to better be able to achieve stewardship both in a one-to-one capacity with investees and at a wider level, then perhaps there's a need for more collaboration because there's an issue of scale. So by direct stewardship, we mean these engagements, including also with the value chain of the company, or asking the company about its value chain, not necessarily just thinking about its very narrow individual operating scope. It's considering issues related to board accountability and competency. It's also about voting and about having escalation strategies in place which sometimes are missing from, from the efforts to engage that certain investors deploy. In some cases, you call it tea and biscuits engagement, but what happens next if nothing is progressing with that company? So escalation is very important. And in some cases, there's strength in numbers, and where it comes to shared goals, then collaboration can be a very important asset to an active engagement strategy. And I'll give an example of that a little bit later. And then considering broader stewardship opportunities, with you were just discussing, Michael, the issue of engagement versus divestment. Well, if investors are able to engage policymakers in what the investable universe is, or what conditions there are to certain companies becoming investable in their sustainability criteria, then they have more power when they actually decide to make their selection in where they will and will not invest, and companies are more likely to understand why it is happening. And if companies understand why investors divest, they're more likely to act on it. There's also the opportunities to engage with standard setters or associations or service providers, so that investors have better data, or so that the services are more able to help them deliver on their stewardship objectives. An example is asking service providers to look more in detail at board composition and comment more on issues related to board votes. And a wider example of this kind of philosophy of impactful stewardship is to look at an example of engagement that took place at the PRI. That was PRI led with investor signatories. And first, so this engagement was an engagement on sustainable palm oil. Investors came together to try and address issues related in particular to deforestation, but also on another range of adjacent topics within the palm oil industry. And it lasted for a decade. So just the sheer scale, trying to not think too much in the short term, that's a good takeaway. And it started with engagement with buyers of palm oils. And then was widened to actually engage growers and processors and traders, so that the upstream part of the supply chain would be involved in conversations about expectations from investors. And as this engagement progressed, another issue that was identified was that there might not have been sufficient stringency on the criteria for these companies up and downstream to be financed, and therefore the investors decided to widen the scope, go a bit broader, and engage the banking sector. They then went downstream and looked at how they could engage the fast-moving consumer goods sector, particularly in Asia, because that's where this industry had the biggest, the biggest exposure and the most materiality. And another important aspect is that when this engagement was concluded, they made a big effort when it came to sharing the findings and the learning and the results of this working group. So I've included a link down there. But it didn't necessarily stop there, and this, engagements about deforestation are still continuing and growing on this best practice. We know that some of the investors involved, but also others, have resorted to using satellite monitoring data to actually ground truth what was happening on the ground in these industries. We know that there have been engagements with governments that have been facilitated by multiple stakeholders. There was call for regulation and backing for regulation, notably in the EU, that happened last year. And there was engagement of affected communities, field visits, and investors lending their support to public complaints, including to CSOs. And here, I think what's really commendable is this effort to think about the problem holistically and not interact with just one stakeholder, but try to take a broader approach and try to talk to everyone who had a valuable insight to provide in this conversation. I'll stop here with my presentation. I hope the example was useful. A few resources that can be shared with attendees if they're interested, and my contact details for more information. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Clara. Excellent. So we'll certainly gonna come back and maybe reflect a little bit more on this interesting example regarding the palm oil industry. But before we do that, let's come to our second speaker. And I would like to introduce Hans-Christoph Hirt, who is the Managing Director and Head of Impact Engagement at UBS Asset Management. Prior to joining UBS, Hans was the managing director and a member of the board of EOS at Federated Hermes. In addition to his work in the financial services sector, Hans is affiliated with the law school at University College London. He's the author of many articles and the co-editor of a forthcoming book on investment management, stewardship, and sustainability. Hans has a multidisciplinary background in business administration, law, accounting and auditing, asset management, and climate science. Sounds like the perfect fit, the perfect match for a topic on engagement with respect to ESG topics. So Hans, we're very happy to have you. Thanks a lot for taking your time. And we're looking forward to your thoughts on this topic.
Great, thank you very much, Michael. And one of the things I found out when I quite recently joined UBS is the fact that people generally know who UBS is and what we do, but maybe very briefly, I mean, we are a global bank which also has a major asset management business, and I'm located in the asset management business, which looks after about 1 trillion assets, US dollar assets under advice across a range of asset classes, so traditional, alternative, real estate, infrastructure, public and private equity. And I'm mainly in the public equities space. We have a range of clients, institutional investors, financial intermediaries, and some private clients. What is not so well known is actually that we have a very long track record in what one would today call stewardship. So we, for example, we started voting on behalf of our clients in 1995. I found out to my great surprise when I joined and implemented our first voting policies in 1998. So that's quite a history. Today, stewardship and voting and engagement, and that means for us dialogue with executives and non-executive directors is really a key part of what we do across the floor. So everyone is involved in that activity, from analysts, from PMs, and then we also have a specialized SI team, sustainable investing team, of which I'm a part, an established and growing team. And why do we do this? I mean, it's quite simple, because we think stewardship helps to protect and or enhance value, and therefore it really underpins everything what we do in sustainability and wealth creation for our clients. And it is a core element of what we believe is our fiduciary duty. We are signatory to stewardship. We have a stewardship policies. We are PRI signatory. We sign up to the UK stewardship codes and other codes around the world. So we're really committed in that space. Maybe one brief word about ESG integration relative to stewardship. I think in that regard, it's useful to think about Principle for Responsible Investment 1, which says you should integrate ESG factors when you invest. And Principle 2 is you should be an active owner once you have invested. So I would see ESG integration, stewardship, both very much as part of sustainable in investing, and that's a very important part of our work here. So very briefly, what does it mean, stewardship responsibilities? And I sometimes realize that it's necessary to reiterate it. For us, stewardship, I mean, it's really first and foremost building relationships with companies, with investee companies, having regular dialogue, having ongoing dialogue to understand risks and opportunities, and understand also the real world impact of companies, and something Clara talked about. Then it is of course about also encouraging change when we're not satisfied, and really tracking our progress in how we achieve that change. Voting is a really important part, but it's a part of it, and I think is most effective if combined with engagement. So we vote, all of our shares were practically across the globe. We also work a lot with other shareholders. So, for example, Climate Action 100+. Our team leads on six of the engagement, is involved in 20 additional ones, and then we are involved in public policy work. Maybe just very briefly on sort of the core elements, I want to focus on engagement and voting. So engagement, just coming back to the question, okay, why do we do engagement? And it's really about identifying, better understanding, and if necessary, addressing long-term issues that drive company value and contributing to the success of a company, and always think about at the same time what are the real world implications, how does it link to the real world. So engagement issues very wide range. Traditional issues like capital allocation of companies, operational performance, but very often also it's around governance. I mean, that's natural because we as shareholders, we elect the board. So that's our sort of primary right, really, we have to encourage change at companies if we think it needs to be, and increasingly focus on long-term sustainability trends, including climate change, but also human capital performance. And here's really topics where the company-specific risks and opportunities can go hand in hand with systemic challenges. So we see our role very much as engaged owners of companies. Where necessary, we encourage change, but we, I think we said this earlier, we also see ourselves really as partners of companies, working with them rather than having sort of confrontational conversations. So what does it mean in numbers? And we're still working on the 2022 statistics, but in 2021 we we had about 1,000 meetings with companies, and 400 of them we categorize as engagement. We have quite a strict definition of engagement, of what it means, really coming back to the point Clara made earlier, that we only talk about engagement when we actually having a message for the company and seeking some change. Maybe if I still may, just a brief word on voting. So as I said, it's very important. It's sort of primary right related to owning a share in most companies, but I think the link to engagement is really important. So we effectively say voting rights has an economic value. And if something has an economic value, then you should better use it. And it's really an opportunity to voice your opinion on a broad range of topics, at an increasing range of topics at shareholder meetings today, which not just include the traditional governance issues, but now also often it's around climate and a whole range of ESG proposals. So we use this really as a lever in our stewardship toolkit to exercise oversight, express our opinion, and then also feedback in a very direct way to companies. So voting, as I said, I think earlier, we try wherever practically to do that in over 60 countries. We actually get tailor-made research from one of the proxy advisors, and I'm sure there will be a question later on about proxy advisors and their role, but we are a client of a proxy advisor, but we get our tailored research based on our policy, which I think sometimes forgotten when the role of proxy advisors is discussed. Generally, we like to support management if possible, but there are actually quite often occasions where we use our vote and vote against, for example, the election of board members, but also remuneration proposals. So the statistic from 2021 was that at 62% of the 12,000 companies where we voted at least against one item on the agenda. So I think that's quite a significant sort of evidence of that we're looking at ballots at shareholder meetings really critically. But I think I stop here because long enough to hear me talk.
No, Hans, we would like to hear you talk even much more, and we'll come back to that. So thanks a lot for sharing your thoughts on this topic. And so let me, now maybe remind our audience that if you have any questions to our speakers, then please post them in the chat so that I can try to pick them up and integrate them, or add them towards the end if we have time in the Q&A. What I would like to follow up, because I think that there was one common theme across both of your statements, is of course about the effort that goes into these activities. So Clara showed this example about the palm oil initiative that stretched over a decade and went upstream and downstream in the supply chain or in the value chain, and affected a lot of players, a lot of companies, a lot of countries, a lot of legislations. So obviously represented a major effort carried by multiple organizations and multiple firms. And so one question that I have in that context is a little bit about the selection of the topics to engage upon, like, resources are constrained, which is maybe something that we can even reflect upon a little bit more. Engagement/stewardship is an activity that is much more effort intensive than, let's say, quantitative asset management and, running a computer machine to identify good investments. So how do you make these choices and priorities? And so maybe let me throw the ball to Clara for a second about the palm oil initiative. And, you described the sequence, but I don't know to what extent you are aware, but can you also share a little bit, maybe some of the information that you have on the decision-making process, how the prioritizations, how the selection of where to go next, like go upstream or downstream or go to this or that geographic area, how you made some of these choices to engage exactly in the way that it actually ended up, in reality?
Sure, I can try. So perhaps I'll start by answering it in general terms and then talk about the palm oil case to the extent that I can. In general, I think, the decision to engage might come from multiple strands of thinking, and those strands will be different depending on the investors, but it will always include some consideration to the size of holding and exposure, the materiality of the ESG factors at hand, and the risks that are estimated to be caused to the company, or how they might contribute to wider systemic issues that those investors are interested in addressing. But importantly, it might also come from client or beneficiary preferences and requests, because these certain topics might be of particular interest, or they might be very sensitive at different scales, maybe nationally or for that particular organization. So it's important to consider that there's always going to be a mix, and different investors might not always agree, and which is why sometimes the geometry of a big engagement, which lasts over a long period, might change in terms of who's involved and how actively, or who takes the lead and who is only supporting at different stages. Also, when an engagement tries to engage multiple different stakeholders, there might be questions of expertise that come to play, where someone who has an investor who has an analyst that's an ESG person that's specialized in commodities, they might be very good to talk to the upstream companies. But perhaps if the engagement then moves to banks, someone else, either within that organization or another investor might kind of switch and be there and be the one to run point. So I wasn't actively involved in those engagements from the inside, because at the time I was actually working for the Zoological Society of London. But I was able to see this change operate over a few years. And an important aspect is that there was a greater and greater understanding at the time that the issue with deforestation wasn't just with with companies that produce the commodities, but also who buys it. And at the end of the day, also it might be with the products that it eventually contain it, which makes sense when you think about the fact that this engagement over time moved to fast-moving consumer goods. There was also greater awareness of the issue with deforestation in common consumption products in Asia at the time, where this engagement was then moved to a different part of the supply chain. So all of these things will matter in making sure that the engagement is coming at the right time and has the maximum impact. I hope this helps with the sector. And one quick example, in terms of the materiality of this issue, is that at that point in time, there was a palm oil company who was a target of a lot of attention when it comes to deforestation issues. And at some point, they were certified on palm oil products, and when their certification was suspended, the share price was actually greatly affected. And this prompted further engagement, and the company actually took all of this on board and made big efforts to change their policies and their approaches. And I think this was seen as by most people as a great win for this kind of interactions.
Excellent. So Hans, how is your view complementary or somewhat different in terms of how you make your choices about selecting the targets for stewardship or engagement?
Yeah, I think completely complementary. So I don't want to repeat everything Clara has said, but I think it is really important, and that's one of the things I'm saying in the book chapter which will be published in next month is to be clear for both asset owners but also asset managers to have a clear overarching objective of stewardship and active ownership, and that's really the starting point. And when you get to the points Clara outlined, I think holdings matters, the nature of holdings matters. Are you big passive house? Are you an active investor? These are important consideration. And when you get into the specific perhaps environmental, social, or governance topics, here again, I think you need to decide what matters for your portfolios. Where can you have a significant influence? What is your expertise in addressing these topics? Where do you have people to engage? One couple of things maybe that are additional to what Clara said. One area we also like to look at is what we call engagement potential. Maybe a good example is companies with high carbon intensity. So there are some companies that are already very green, and other companies where, as an investor, you can contribute to the greening of companies. And when we look at the potential, then we would say engagement with a maybe at the moment carbon intensive company, there's more potential for us to have an impact. That's important. And the other one, or maybe two more to add, what we sometimes call engageability. You also need it takes two to tango in a way. For having a constructive dialogue, you need to have at least people at the other side who are open to the dialogue, who are listening more than who want to work together. So that's factored in when we pick engagement. Then last but not least, and that's from my experience in working in this industry and engagement for 18 years, I think you just need to be honest and focus on companies. I think there are too many examples where industry players say they're engaging with several thousand companies, and I think we need to be honest. And it's much if you're really talking about engagement the way Clara defined it, then it's for individual institutions, probably much smaller numbers. But then the great thing is that we have collaboration like Climate Action 100, and we can build on these and leverage to get over the fact that there are resource constraints. So I think I stop here, but really important question.
But let me follow up a little bit more on this, because there's also a few questions coming in from the audience in that respect. So I think that's something that people are interested in. So you mentioned this concept of engageability. I like the formulation of it needs two to tango. I think that's great, and that's true. But can you give us a few more thoughts on how do you determine that? Right? Does it depend more on your experience in interacting to see that the firm is responsive? Does it depend on the size of your share of your stake in the company? Does it depend on the other ownership structure? Let's say if there's concentrated ownership in a given company, maybe it's going to be harder to have any impact. Does it depend on the corporate governance in place at the company, that if it has a better corporate governance already in place, it's maybe more responsive to what you would like to know? Do any of these dimensions matter in your decision-making process, or is it something completely different?
I think all of the above. I think you gave almost the textbook example. I think it does involve to establish engageability. You need to get on the phone, or you need to have a meeting and try to have a conversation, see how the company reacts. But then all the factors you outlined. I mean, we typically are a significant shareholder on the register of many companies. But for smaller investors, it will sometimes be even just get a hearing and get the foot in the door can be difficult, and then it's sort of factors you described. I think it's about the individuals, it's about the people, CEO, board, how open are they to dialogue. And then I think critically also, and I experienced that when I started to engage with companies in Germany in 15, 16 years ago, and it was just not common to have dialogue with the chair, non-executive in the German two-tier system, and so regional differences also play an important role in terms of who do you talk to and at what level, and also frankly the quality of the dialogues is different. And then maybe last point, an excellent point, is of course also about the shareholding structure, and block shareholders can be very good and can help dialogue, but block shareholders can also complicate matters, and then it depends on the nature of that shareholder.
Excellent. The other topic that I wanted to pick up, because I think both you and Clara mentioned it, and so I wanted to come
Clara
back to
had
Clara.
An extra. Oh yeah, sorry.
Sorry, Clara, you wanted to add something on the conversation about sort of engageability. Go ahead. Sorry, my apologies.
No problem at all. I just wanted to really emphasize something that Hans-Christoph mentioned, which was in terms of collaboration and the role of smaller shareholders. And in certain cases, there'll be more difficulties of accessing certain companies, being able to make up calls. But in other cases, it might be that smaller shareholders in the target, in the country where the company is headquartered, might be able to get that meeting. And the fact that they might be able to bring also a stakeholder coming from the outside might mean that the conversation might be, more qualitative and more ambitious because of this collaboration between different shareholders from different places. And so it's always important to think, okay, perhaps I'm too small, but perhaps I'm not, or perhaps I have something to bring, even if I am too small. And considering collaboration can be a way to overcome certain obstacles that might be found in engagement.
Excellent. My apologies, I didn't see the raised hand. Actually, there's too many pictures, too many. I'm following the chat and trying to, these kind of things. So my apologies for missing the raised hand. So I wanted to come back to you, Clara, actually on this point of materiality, because that's something that both of you mentioned in your answer before and in your presentation. And of course, it's kind of it's an interesting concept to argue. Obviously, you wanna engage on topics that are material, but the question still is, I guess, the devil is in the detail about how to determine what is material. And I guess there could be potentially conflicting directions if something is material for financial performance or for for a sustainability oriented development goal, for example. So how do you feel that? Or do you think these are usually, is it easy to identify what is material, or is it harder? Or can you share some thoughts on how you think these kind of decisions or prioritization should be made in terms of identifying material topics? Clara, what do you think about that?
I would start by saying that investors tend to have an idea of the time horizon that they're looking at when they're investing, and how long they're planning to stay within the company. And if you think about, like the average person with savings, or like a good bulk of the clientele of investors, then there's often a need to look at long-term returns and long-term value. And certain activities might be very profitable in the short term, but they might create instant backlash, or they might have medium to longer term impact that then are problematic. And then there's the issue with systemic risk, which is even more difficult, because it might be placing a constraint in the short term to prevent delay or reduce the impact of a longer term but known issue. And I think here that there's just no magic. There's no magic calculation. But it's important to be informed about the wider set of risks that are beyond just what you can see in the company's books. And that's why it's so important that investors look at integrating ESG issues from the outset in their whole processes, and not just at the time of deciding when they want to engage. And I'll leave Hans to answer now.
Okay, thanks, Clara. So Hans, from your perspective, like, without revealing too many details about the process at UBS or other places that you were at, but that decision about what is material or not, is that something that should be driven more, let's say, from a team like your team on engagement, or should it come also from asset management, or is it a collaboration of all the different components that are usually making asset management decisions or asset allocation decisions in an asset manager? How do you think about the process of arriving at the material score, so to speak?
Yeah, I think everyone together. There are different people bring different insights to the process of identifying what are sort of general material issues for specific sectors, and that's, I think, now quite common amongst asset managers, that there's sort of thinking what in a specific sector, what are the most important material issues. There's also standard setting up around, and there's some guidance. But I think the beauty also particular of active management is of course that you can come to different conclusions what is material for specific company over what time horizons. And so for example, climate is a classic topic. How will regulation impact upon the value of companies in different sectors? And people will have very different opinions about this, but typically most would now agree that for very many companies, if not all companies, carbon emissions will matter, and will even matter even more. So I think it's a really critical exercise, the assessing materiality, and definitely needs to be made between people who are allocating the capital, but then also experts in the space. Sustainable investing teams will have important insights, but it needs to be driven also by the capital allocators.
Excellent. So actually, given that we are talking a little bit about the process of engaging, I have a quick question I think fits in here well that came up in the chat about the optimal size of an engagement team. So if I want to rephrase it, I don't know, Hans, are you happy with the size of your engagement team? Or you would like to have more people? Or do you have any indications about what do you think is a good size team for an asset manager who thinks about, for example, starting to become more active or exercise more active, become a more active owner, so to speak? Are there any guidances you can provide on resource allocations, so to speak, within a company, an asset manager?
So I probably hand over the question to Clara, who's leading a very important project on that very question. But I think it depends, is unfortunately the answer, and I also think it depends. Do you need and to what extent do you need a separate team, particularly in the active space? So I think one I always said, when I retire, I hope that in active management, you don't have specialists anymore. You have portfolio managers who are doing the ESG integration and who are doing the active ownership and the engagement. So I think that's an easy answer, but you're probably not quite there. And then there's a lot of engagement to be done. So I think it just depends on what organization, what's the investment style, how is it related to the investment products, how many people you want ideally in a team. But I think Clara will talk about this. It's also clear that at the moment there just isn't enough there isn't enough resource, and there's not enough quality engagement as a result in the industry.
So before moving over to Clara, I think it's actually an interesting thought that maybe in the future, and we'll come back towards the end about sort of the outlook, that active ownership, stewardship, engagement teams might not be separate teams, but it might just be a much more integrated role or integrated skill set, so to speak, for the average asset manager. I think that's an interesting prediction for maybe the future. Clara, what are your thoughts on the resource allocation within stewardship?
I couldn't agree more with the comments from Hans and yourself in terms of, there's not going to be a one size fits all answer. And it also will depend on how this function is structured and spread out across an organization. And sometimes as well, you might want to take into account whether certain of these stewardship functions are actually internalized or externally managed. And there's a real role for service providers there to also be able to offer that certain services at a cost that is manageable for smaller investors, or to be able to to have all of the expertise needed for certain topics which might not be for which there might not be experts internally within smaller financial institutions. So that's the first point. The question might not just be what's the ideal size for the stewardship team, but how well trained it is and how well the processes internally work, because you could have a very big team, but if no one listens to them or if the information doesn't circulate well, then it can be difficult. In other cases as well, you might have a big team, but you might have an even bigger portfolio, and it's important not to ask the questions only in absolute terms, but try to understand how many, for example, how many engagers per engagement, or how many engagers per portfolio companies, how many engagements per portfolio companies. Try to better disaggregate, what's happening, and the level of oversight that are the assets under engagement, or the companies under engagement, because in certain cases we hear about bigger teams, but it might not be commensurate with that. And it's also interesting to understand how the trend has been going for that company or for that investor. So if you're, for example, an asset owner trying to understand how managers is resourcing the stewardship function, how the team might have changed over time is a figure that might have been discussed. For example, we doubled our stewardship team, but if the AUM has also doubled, then you're left with a similar scenario as before. We have a project at the moment at the PRI looking at this issue, trying to understand how we can right-size the stewardship resourcing ambition. And it's not just about, what do we think might be currently happening. We see that there are trends and expectations for continued growth in stewardship team to a limited extent, at least in the next couple of years. But is that enough? And how much should stewardship team resources be increased in the face of the systemic risk that we are facing? And are investors really pulling their weight when it comes to addressing these issues? This is a much bigger issue, and to a certain extent, I think there's a certain level of knowledge in the industry that resources are insufficient, but also that the pace of change societally right now has been too slow. So that raises a lot of questions. Feel free to reach out if you would like to discuss this more.
That does indeed, raise a couple of questions. Actually, one that was also brought up in the chat, and I think that fits in here very well, is actually about, it's kind of like a little bit looking at the other side about if I look from outside at an asset manager and the stewardship function and how it's resourced and how it's set up. Are there signs or indications about whether it is a serious endeavor or whether it's maybe something that is just window dressing? So, you're talking about sizes and ways to do it and resourcing. Could I also sort of refine what you just said and say, okay, if I, as a client or as a regulator, see an asset manager who claims to do this and that, but that is not credible, or that is not enough to be sort of, engaging or exercising the stewardship function in a way that is efficient. Is that a fair way to say, or do you have criteria to assess whether, an asset manager takes stewardship seriously?
There's not a one-size-fits-all formula to how efficient an engagement is, but I think trying to go beyond the input, so the activities, we've sent that many emails, we've had that many meetings, but also distinguish, like Hans did before, what were meetings that were actually related to having specific asks, or what were meetings that were more for general allocation processes. Also trying to better understand what is the objective of the engagements, what is the expected outcome, and how an organization might be progressing towards it. And in some cases, it might be that an asset manager or even an asset owner doing direct engagements might not see how their individual activity has been able to contribute towards the outcome, but you can still see to an extent whether it looks like the company or the industry in question is moving in a certain direction.
So I guess this raises also the issue about how to measure outcome of a stewardship activity or of an engagement activity. So Hans, what do you think are good measures or good ways to measure outcome, or to capture or to report outcomes of engagement or stewardship activities?
Maybe just, even though I'm kind of feel a little bit conflicted about the last question, maybe just my my quick view. I think it's also a little bit about like looking at the board. When you look at the stewardship team, I think there's an indication of getting one. There's an interesting, should be a mix between experience and skills, given the amount of topics a typical team covers. So expertise in climate change or natural capital is really important. And then I think there's also something to be said for having not just people who just finished university, but sort of a mix of some people who maybe have done this for some time. I think it is a real advantage. but again, it's probably the diversity of the team I would be looking at. But yeah, I'm conflicted here to make that comment. Coming back to the way it works for us is that we are the number of companies, so 400 engagements, that for these engagements we define outcomes, or we define objectives in the meetings, and the idea is that you over time you can track your progress towards achieving objectives, and that's really that's one of the approaches which I think is sort of taking on in the industry, in which has become best practice, so that you have an idea when you go into conversation what is it you're concerned about, what is it you want to change, and then you raise it, and then you assess over time how much progress you make. So that's it's one technique of outcomes measurement. The other one, and that's sort of talking about generally industry, is also about what is done often in impact strategies. So thinking about could we ask the companies, or could the company confirm our role as an investor in change? And that's certainly something I have seen in the industry, not just in impact strategies, but that is being done where a company acknowledges the contribution investors have made. Then a company might be willing to acknowledge that also public, which I think is a very powerful signal that stewardship is working. So case studies endorsed by companies can also be really useful. And then there are sort of a range of studies. I think there was a link in Clara's presentation that also demonstrate. I remember when I started this 15-16 years ago, clients always said, okay, show us the value add, and some academics have done some robust studies. Now they're still relatively far and few between, but there is some evidence now relating engagement work with financial outcomes.
This is like the perfect bridge to an obviously important topic. That is, of course, connecting, engagement-based activities to financial performance. And so what I would like to ask you, or ask for your reflections upon, is a little bit also first of all, the value consequences of engagement-based activities. As you pointed out, Hans, there have been a couple of studies that look at the market response to successful ESG-related engagements or voting activities or outcomes at shareholder meetings. And these studies do find that there is a positive market response to successful engagements, and there are sometimes negative, or oftentimes negative market responses to unsuccessful engagement, suggesting that it is value creating to engage. So the first question that I have to you in that context, and maybe let's start with Clara, is what your view is on, you mentioned long-term value creation. You also mentioned earlier that maybe in the short term, sometimes there might be negative short-term financial performance consequences. But what are your views on the value creation through ESG-related engagements? Do you think there is a strong relationship? Do you sometimes see there is a tension? What are your views on this?
Sure. So I think first of all, like when I was referring to short-term value impacts, I meant that certain practices that are particularly short-term and on behalf of companies, like for example, like in cases where there might be corners that are being cut, or very aggressive pricing or staffing strategies, that they might result in a loss of license to operate and issues that might impact their operations very quickly, and therefore it might have looked like a cost saving, but sometimes it's not. So that's what I was referring to here specifically. I think we can all think of cases where a governance failure or the overlooking an environmental or social issue has led to value loss, and I think a good example that we can think of here, and that has then resulted in investor engagement and efforts to address this issue, has been the failing of a storage facility at the Brumadinho Dam, which resulted in nearly 300 deaths, I think 270. It's resulted in enormous environmental damage and as of now, it's been several billions in terms of payouts and fines, and there's been also charges, homicide charges brought against some of the management. And when you think about how could this have been prevented, then there's a clear case for investors to address this very material issue, because there's thousands of such facilities in the world right now. And a good example of a reaction from investors on this was the investors Tam Taylor's initiative that was set up by Church of England, as well as the Council of Ethics in the Norwegian Council on Ethics, and it led to the creation of standards. It led to a lot of engagement. I think close to 300 mining organizations have now been engaged through this process, and you know that the safety of these mines and you know the risk of this happening somewhere else is hopefully greatly reduced. So you can see the case here. Obviously, it would be better if investors were able to better identify these issues before they happen, to protect the value and create better outcomes from the outset. So I think this is a good example we have.
Great, Hans. What are your views on the value creation through stewardship activities?
Yeah, I mentioned the study we did in my previous previous employer, which was quite I think quite important to start addressing that issue. But as Clara said, I think it's intuitive sometimes. We all know the examples in the industry. It's clear that we are addressing material risk very often that prevent accidents from happening. It's also clear that we are creating value enhancing change with companies, be that in making boards better or getting companies to transition more quickly. But it's I think a challenge, the holy grail, some people say, and then how do you link it to a specific portfolio over a specific time period? And I think that challenge won't go very quickly. But do we believe that we protect and enhance value of investments on behalf of our clients? And the answer is absolutely yes. And I think the proof is really difficult to have academic evidence and show that it sort of lands in your particular portfolio, not least because you're creating a public good, of course, also for other investors.
Great. So one question that I also that is related to a topic that I wanted to bring up, and I think you mentioned it earlier, both of you, in terms of sometimes outsourcing some services. You, Hans, already referred to proxy advisors on the voting, and I also had a question in the chat about data sourcing, like where the data comes from that goes into the process of stewardship. And you know, the question in the chat was specifically dedicated to Hans to understand a little bit better whether a lot of the data that is used comes maybe from sources that potentially also other asset managers could use, or whether a lot of the data creation is just in-house and results basically in proprietary data that is only used in-house. So Hans, can you maybe comment briefly on that aspect?
Yeah, it's a mix of both. So we buy in a lot of data, but then we use it and bring it together in different ways, and then of course add to it. That's sort of part of the investment proposition. So short answer, yes, we buy in a lot, but it will be different in the end use because of the way we put it together and the way we add to it.
But are there general initiatives on a more global market level? Maybe Clara, you know more about that, to create databases that could potentially be more broadly used by investors to, you know, to guide their stewardship activities, so that not everybody has to not everybody is able to go through this process or to put the same kind of resources to this activity like large players like UBS.
Sure. So I'm sure that Hans actually will know so many more data sets than I do from his position, you know, working on impact and through his experience. But one I think non-negligible source of action useful data is actually civil society. It can be from a qualitative perspective where, you know, civil society organizations and NGOs might be the ones to blow the whistle on serious issues that a company is perhaps not being very upfront about or is maybe not yet aware of. and so that's a very important aspect. But there's been much more work from these organizations to organize themselves in being directly useful to the financial sector, to address issues through these channels, through the finance angle. And an example is the World Benchmark Alliance, which I think was set up by a number of investors as well, including one I can recall is Aviva. There's also the cases of much more specialist data sets that are being created or cases where investors put their resource together to generate information. So there's the case of, for example, these investors getting deforestation related data, working with a satellite imagery provider and putting, paying the bill together for that. And there's the cases of also of data sets that are created for completely free of charge by NGOs. They create benchmarks, they create scorecards, and sometimes they track year on year. And this can be used by investors to supplement the qualitative and the huge amounts of data that they might be also getting that they may be getting from commercial providers. And collaboration with academia is also where investors can really make a difference, both by sharing some of their own data so that there can be learning in the industry, but also playing more collectively and supporting academic research that benefit to everyone.
That's maybe the most beautiful sentence I've heard in the entire conversation so far, even though I heard many of them. But of course, being an academic, I think we all should take Clara's suggestion very, very seriously. And in case you're in need of any academic to work with, please, feel free to contact me. We're very happy whenever we get access to interesting data to run studies in this. I completely agree. I think that's obviously, very important, especially on topics such as stewardship and engagement, because the access to the data is less clear, less straightforward. Most of the papers that are published in academia on this area are out of collaborations between individual asset managers and using their proprietary data to study and comprehensively work with it. So thanks, Clara, for bringing this up. Now, one question that I wanted to point out, because obviously we have not talked too much, and we're running out of time a little bit in terms of the tools that are used. Obviously, voting is the most obvious tool, given the case of that it's about active ownership, and it's one of the rights of the owners to vote on issues. And so I wanted to ask Hans very quickly before we're going to do the last round to comment on, because you already hinted at it and at UBS's strategy on sort of how you rely on the work of proxy advisors, and to what extent that is important or is helping you in making your stewardship decisions, or identify objects for your stewardship activities.
So I think two questions here. One, since we have had since 1998 our own voting policy, which is sort of developed every year and sort of strengthened, tightened, and adjusted to accommodate new topics such as climate resolutions recently, or looking at the board of directors in terms of net zero plans. And that then allows us, because of the specificity of the policy, to work with one of the large proxy advisors and ask them really to produce us a tailor-made policy recommendations. So we don't, it's very different from what the provider would typically have, but we basically get tailor-made research done, and that's I think really important to sort of recognize that, because very often it's talked about the influence of proxy advisors, but I think it's fair to say that UBS Asset Management is not alone in asking tailor-made policies recommendations to be produced. So that's important. But as I also said, it's only one tool, and unless you're a large shareholder, just voting against may sort of annoy the company if it's board of director elections, but the real influence comes when you then follow up with engagement and focus and specific proposals of what you want to change. Because sometimes companies simply don't know. They get the vote against, but don't know what happened. What do we need to do to get better. So that's coming to the second part of your questions. We're also looking at working on building on the ESG data we just talked about in previous questions, but then also looking at where have we consistently voted against items to open dialogues and have conversations with companies to address these concerns.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So, in the interest of time, I would like to, before we do the concluding round, I had one more question that so far didn't really fit in well that I wanted to ask, and I'm not exactly sure if it goes more to Clara or Hans. Let me just pose it, and then we'll see. And it's actually a question a little bit about regulation. And the question is, how does the EFA-MA Stewardship Code, which I think is for the UK, fit into Clara's view of code? So it's dedicated to Clara, but I'm not, if one of you has a view on how the EFA-MA Stewardship Code fits in, so to speak, then please share your views very briefly. Clara, you want to take it?
I'll start with a wider level comment, because I think Hans here has perhaps a bit more expertise on specific codes, including the UK Stewardship Code. From our perspective, it's very important that stewardship code being adopted, because it expresses the regulator's support and interest in stewardship, and it also helps placing it through a specific lens. And to give an example of this is that the UK Stewardship Code specifically considers the issue of the issue of outcomes, and so it is a good standard for investors to understand where the expectation is at the level. But it's also really useful for companies to know that there are expectations towards them, and that this is about value creation. I'll pass on to Hans now.
Yeah, I'm not sort of completely familiar with the FAMA code. I think is a stewardship code, but I would echo what Clara said. I think stewardship codes have helped very significantly to move the discussion forward in the UK. With the first code in 2010 was very much in the vanguard, but then interestingly, the most recent version, the 2020 version of the UK Stewardship Code, was then based on a recognition of saying, yes, we have a code, we have many signatory, but still not enough is happening in practice. So I think the answer is yes, Stewardship Code is great, but it really is not enough to get investors going and really to encourage and nurture more high quality outcomes-based engagement.
Great. So let's follow up on this last thought to actually also reflect a little bit on how the two of you think this is going to develop further. So Hans, given that you just reflected on that, maybe what has happened so far or over the last couple of years has been on the right direction, but maybe not yet sufficient to maybe have as much as an impact as it should be, or as we maybe would like to have. So how do you think about the next the development of stewardship oriented activities over the next 5 to 10 years? Do you expect it to grow? Do you see important challenges along the way? What are your thoughts in that respect?
It's coming. Many of the topics we have been talking about come together. So I think it's the outcomes focus, the thinking about how can we show that stewardship engagement contributes to portfolios, but also contributes to real world outcomes, having more evidence, but then also for asset owners who allocate the money to asset managers, then really trying to work out which ones are the asset managers who are doing a leading job in this space, and keeping that in mind when defining requirements before appointing asset managers. But I think I'm sort of overall bullish in the active fund management space. As I said previously, I think there's a real possibility that we will, over the next generation or next 2 generations of fund managers, that they become ESG savvy and they become engagement savvy, and that this combination then becomes a real differentiator in active management. The bigger challenge is in passive, where you have a lot of holdings typically to cover, but you don't have a fund manager or analysts necessarily covering these companies, and there's a role for specialist stewardship teams, and again, there needs to be a recognition this activity adds value or protects value, and someone needs to recognize this and ultimately pay for that activity. So again, I think the project Clara is leading is really, really important in that regard.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Hans. Clara, what do you think about the developments in the next couple of years?
So in the next couple of years, I think, like, based on, you know, so it really depends on the regions, right? But at least for the UK, there was a study done by the FRC as a follow-up to the UK Stewardship Code, and among the questions they were asking respondents was whether they saw resources allocated to stewardship growing or not, and in terms of staffing, and great majority so that it would change, increase to an extent, and perhaps even significantly. So I think about a third, a bit less than a third. So it increased significantly, and we see this as compatible with the kind of needs we have. The question is whether this increase will be commensurate with the financial risk that are derived from, you know, from systemic issues such as rising inequality, climate change, or biodiversity loss. Putting that to the side, you know, the issue you raised with, you know, passive investment here, again, would like to echo something that Hans stated. You still vote your shares in that context, and if you're didactic and pedagogic about why you voted the way you did, or if there is, you know, there is clear policies published about what expected vote would be on certain issues, then it can be powerful. The issue of regulation as well, of disclosing votes and disclosing efforts done and also decisions in relation to what's investable and not investable under certain mandates are really important. And here again, you know, you mentioned at the beginning of the webinar the issue of whether it was possible to have an impact if you're not even investing, or if you're excluding certain sectors. Here again, if sectors know why they're being excluded, or in cases where investors decide that they have exhausted engagement opportunities and they divest, and there's something to be done about communicating before divesting, communicating at the time of divestment, perhaps also setting expectations as to what might cause the organization to reconsider reinvesting in the sector, and these are things that, you know, companies can pick up even if there's not necessarily a very active strategy and there's not constantly engagement towards the company. In terms of the outlook, and sorry, I'm going to stop there. We are looking at how much resources should be put in stewardship, and we're trying to come up with hopefully a methodology that could be scalable and adapted to different kinds of investors, because again, there is no one size fits all, but it's probably more than we're doing now. If I have a bit of space for a call to action, perhaps as we close, I'll have a few more things to add, but that answers the question on resourcing in the next few years.
So I think we are at the end. So Clara, if you want to share those last thoughts, then I think that's the time right now, because we are basically out of time. Please go ahead.
Perhaps. Thank you. Thank you for the extra time. Generally, we'd say that leading investors should be prepared to adequately resource stewardship, both internally and with the service providers that they're using with, right? Proxy advisors have an important role to play, and they need to be doing their work in good conditions. It's the same for engagement service providers and other ones. It's also important that service providers are engaged on the level of expectation and on the quality of the work they're doing, on the issues they are looking at, and on the topics on which they advise their clients. And so engaging with companies is great. Also engaging with the wider industry about how it's doing right now is important. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. I think at this point in time, I don't have much to add. I think those were very good concluding remarks for this session. Thank you very much, Clara. Thank you very much, Hans, for taking your time, for being with us today, and sharing your views and thoughts on this topic. I learned a lot and really enjoyed the conversation and discussion. Thanks to our audience for showing up. I hope everyone found it interesting as well. I also hope that I didn't miss at least not too many questions. If I missed some of the questions, my apologies for that. Other than that, I wish everybody a nice day and hope to see many of you back for the next instance of this seminar series. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.